Here we go. Let's see. Okay, let's pray. Father God, we thank you so much that you just allow us this privilege to come together in fellowship over the airways. Even as I always ask you, Father, that you would watch over all the technology and let everything work well. And just pray that you'll give Kenneth your peace, your wisdom, your clarity. Just let your Spirit guide us through this time together. Let us learn what you want us to be learning, Lord. And just thank you for the good work that you've given Ken to do there, Lord, in Chicago. And just pray that you're going to continue to bless him and give him just direction and wisdom for this Shalom community that is on his heart. Thank you, Father. We just commend all these things to you and trust you to watch over us and guide us through this time. It's in your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, let me just kind of go over the ground rules, the agenda that we'll be kind of working with today. We're going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes as Kenneth leads us through a PowerPoint presentation, just to kind of give us an overview of the project and what he's been doing. After that, we will then spend a little time in discussion, just be thinking of any thoughts, questions, topics that you'd like to raise during a discussion time. After we've had a bit of discussion, the three of us who are kind of the voting members of the community of this meeting will meet together for an evaluation session. I'll need to pull others out of the session for about 15 minutes. Your screen will say something like, "No, you're on hold." Once we've finished our evaluation session, then we'll bring everybody back in and we'll announce the results of that evaluation. With that, Kenneth, why don't you go ahead and take the microphone and start leading us through your presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Payne. Can you hear me?
I can hear you great. Yep.
Awesome. Well, my name is Kenneth Michael Nole, and I'm a candidate for the Doctor of Transformational Leadership degree within the framework of cultural transformation at Bakke Graduate University. And I have the pleasure this afternoon of presenting my research on HIV in the ghetto and analysis of the lived experiences of African-American women with HIV in Chicago's inner city. Before I actually go into my presentation, we've already done introductions, but I would like to say thank you to Dr. Bill Payne, to Dr. Gilliam Jill, Dr. Ty Ling, Jamal Miller, and Dr. Carolyn Champion. I'll now begin my presentation. If I can give a summary of my overall research, I would simply say that African-American women with HIV who live in the inner city of Chicago have experienced the lack of medical assistance, healthier foods, support from the African-American church, support from the community, as well as economic instability. This has caused them to be the underserved of the inner cities of Chicago due to the stigma associated with HIV. This leads me to my objective and the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study is to explore the lived experiences of African-American women with HIV in Chicago's inner city qualitatively, to make an evidence-based argument for the development of a Shalom community. Now, what is a Shalom community? This is my definition. It is one in which individuals can share their stories, engage in holistic programs that comprise of education, nutrition, and social support. And there's even more, and I'll discuss that in my intervention strategies. The objective of these communities and spaces, and I use communities and spaces interchangeably because I believe that Shalom communities are spaces and these spaces can turn into communities, is to provide a healthy social environment where African-American women with HIV will experience redemption, restoration, and hope. And I would love to, if I have time at the end of this presentation, to elaborate on what I believe restoration, redemption, and hope is as a transformative theology. This leads me to my historical context and how HIV began, or where we know HIV has began. In the 1970s and the 1980s is where this idea or this epidemic of HIV emerged, preferably in the homosexual population, later attributed to the heterosexual population. And now there are many ways that HIV or this virus has been spread, and that's through blood transfusions, drugs, through needles, and I'll talk about the impact of drugs in the community in a few minutes, having multiple sex partners or a sex partner uncertain of their diagnosis. R.L. Jackson and Leslie Miles are two authors that I use in my research, but they talk about the psychological effects of HIV. And this is where I get this idea of what trauma looks like. And that's found also in my case study and how I define trauma. Just being diagnosed with HIV, what it does psychologically to the mind of those who are actually diagnosed or newly diagnosed with HIV. It goes on to talk about in the historical context that at this time in the 1970s and 80s, there was no real viable treatments available. And so depression and suicide were some of the byproducts of this hopelessness that emerged during this time. I would like to give further historical context of what this looks like, and if I can just hone in for the sake of time just to one picture at the bottom where there are two African-American women, and it says HIV, do the right thing, use a condom. This was found in the 1980s, and there's a picture of two African-American women, which precisely lets us know that this was an epidemic in the 1980s where it began to increase during in the African-American community. The idea here is that there was a lack of contraception. Even today's time, it's not that we do not have contraception, but there's a lack of the usage of contraception in the African-American community. Even during this time, there were celebrities such as Patti LaBelle who had become an advocate for being tested for AIDS and HIV. This leads me to the problems that are found in the inner city context in Chicago. According to the Center of Disease Control and Prevention in 2017, they suggest that African-American women in the inner city of Chicago, their average income is $20,175. According to the HIV and STI surveillance report, between 2004 and 2015, there were 973 HIV cases that emerged. Now, amongst these 973, there was 138 of those 973 that were just women. But amongst that 138, there were 110 African-American women who had been diagnosed with HIV, which simply means there was an increase amongst the African-American culture with specifically for the African-American women. Today, there's a big jump, and there are approximately 3,422 cases of HIV amongst African-American women in Chicago's inner city. And I would love to, at the end or somewhere, if I have time, to talk about what those causes were and why there was a big jump between 2014 to 2017. But the highlight of the problem in the inner city of Chicago is low income, unemployment, poor housing, a decline in Chicago public Chicago public school system, high rates in crime, increased drug activity, lack of medical care, and a disconnection from the African-American church with African-American women with HIV. Dr. Tanya Sharp, I used her research a lot in my dissertation, but she even goes on to talk about the effect of drugs in the inner city of Chicago and how the inability to cope with the pressures of oppression. And when I talk about the pressures of oppression, I'm talking about the inner city problems that I stated in the bullet point above, how narcotics is a means by which inner city African-American residents, and specifically within my research, African-American women find relief, also along with casual sex and paid sex, which is prostitution, which is also something that's very prevalent in the inner city of Chicago. This leads me to another favorite of mine, which is another problem found in the inner city of Chicago. And because there is a severity of poverty in the inner city context, it becomes impossible to afford healthy foods. The inner city of Chicago is left with foods that are processed. So we have a lot of liquor stores. We have a lot of corner stores that sells junk food. And when I talk about junk food, I'm talking about chips and pickles and things of that sort, and high in cholesterol and sugar and starch and high in fat. Amongst these restaurants, and I won't name them all, but we have a lot of Sharp's Chicken. We have a lot of barbecue joints and soul food restaurants and White Castle. And Dr. Bill, when you come to Chicago, you have to go to Harold's Chicken. Now, we have a lot of them, but Harold's Chicken and Taco Bell and Baba's, these are restaurants that are high in cholesterol and sugar and starch and things of that sort. And this is the problem in the Black ghetto. Dr. Allison O'Daniels discovered that African American women with HIV are financially unstable and they're more at risk in their health management. That simply means that if they do not have the proper funds to purchase these foods, that there's a way that they can actually, their health can decline because they can't eat the proper foods to actually help them live. This also leads me to the next problem found in the African-American community. Studies have shown that good healthcare options for African-American women with HIV are limited due to poverty in the inner city context. Here's an issue. The average lifetime cost of HIV treatments is roughly $400,000. Now, without insurance, the average cost out of pocket for HIV treatment is between $14,000 and $20,000 a year. Now, if the average cost or the average income for African-American women with HIV, if it's $20,175, there is no way that they can afford the proper medicine to help them live through and coping through HIV or their diagnosis. The African-American woman with HIV, after having a conversation with Dr. Tayi via just understanding this idea of HIV in the African-American community, it was suggested that there are a lot of women who actually have jobs. All the African-American women with HIV are not poor, but those that do have jobs, they cannot hit a certain tax bracket. They cannot go over $47,500 because if they do, they will lose their Ryan White insurance. The problem with the Ryan White insurance is that it only reaches 52% of women that are diagnosed with HIV in the United States, not just Chicago, 52% in the United States. Amongst those 52% that are eligible for assistance, they must enroll during the enrollment period. Years ago, that period was about 4 months. But between 2016 and 2017, that enrollment period is now 6 weeks. The problem with that is once this enrollment period is over, they have to wait a whole nother year in order to enroll again. So that means they go another year without medicine. Insurance companies have found African-American women high at risk. In this chapter, in chapter 3, in the healthcare system section, there's an author by the name of H.V. Nelson that simply says that they have been marked as the disadvantage in the African-American community because they cannot afford the proper foods and the proper medicines to survive. This leads me to another problem. The African American church. There's a lot of skepticism in the African American church around the stigma that's assigned to HIV patients. Maxwell, who does a study, simply says, and a lot of leaders in churches said that publicly, HIV positive persons deserve their fate. Now, there's another slide. This next slide is a picture of a man by the name, or pastor in Birmingham, Alabama. Excuse me. Now, this is the South, and this is not the inner city of Chicago. I wish that I could find a picture of the inner city context where the African-American church has said things subliminally like this. But Pastor Michael B. Jordan simply says that AIDS is God's curse on homosexual life. Now, my research is not on AIDS and my research is not on homosexuality. But if I must use this picture, I would simply say that the principle still applies and that the message to the church and the disconnect to from the church to the African-American community still stands. That African-American women who have been diagnosed with HIV, their sickness is a curse for how they got the disease. Perhaps they were sexual immoral, or maybe that's not the case, or maybe they were doing drugs, or whatever have you. However they contracted the disease, this is God's curse against them. Now, let me address this. How have the problems been addressed? The truth is, Dr. Payne, Dr. Jill, Dr. Tayi, these problems have not been addressed in the inner city of Chicago. Homeless shelters are still closing. HIV clinics are low on staff due to pay grade as well as closing. Chicago public schools are still closing and boarding up. Unemployment is still prevalent. Drugs and prostitution still exist. The healthcare system has still excluded African-American women with HIV as risk. The Black diet remains the same, and HIV cases are yet increasing. This leads me to my next slide on my audience. Who am I targeting my research to? very quickly. Healthcare centers, HIV clinics, HIV prevention programs, universities and seminaries in Chicago, African-American women with HIV in Chicago, and HIV activists. And the reason why is because they are the voices. And if I could partner with each of them, they would help me actually establish this Shalom community for African-American women with HIV in Chicago's inner city. Next, I would like to talk about my research and methodology. Quantitative research was conducted in the form of interviews. I read a lot of books, and the books that I actually read were books that were on topics such as caring for the poor and broken homes in the Black community, and Black women in the inner city, and the Black church, and Black liberation theology, just to get an understanding of the Black experience. Also, how does HIV look within the African-American context in the inner cities around the country, but more importantly, in Chicago. Interviews were conducted in the inner city, specifically in Inglewood and South Shore, coffee shops, clinics, and offices. I actually had fun doing those because I used the appreciative inquiry approach in just moving from one place to another and gathering the assumptions of those lived experiences for the inner city context. And I covered 4 different areas. And that was the experiential. So I wanted to make sure that I captured the lived experiences of African-American women with HIV, those from the African-American church, the ecclesial portion. And number 3, the communal, the African-American milieu, and number 4, healthcare, the healthcare system. And you will see that in chapter 3 of my dissertation, I deal with every part of those 4 categories. The next, my interviews lasted about 1 hour and 30 minutes, and they were manually recorded. They were manually recorded because I wanted the sessions to be very authentic. I know I'm running out of time, but I'll go to my next slide. And I wanted to make sure that I added just some pictures of my research. These are some of the books that I actually read that helped me understand the African-American context on better. Data was coded by 2 trained coders who have counseling experience. The codes that were found in my research were a byproduct of the keywords, and these keywords were found in data in the interview section. These codes that were expounded on the most were highlighted, and they were used to determine the need for Shalom communities in the inner city of Chicago. This leads me to just more in depth who I actually interviewed. These were participants from the ages of 25 and 50 years old. All participants were African-American because I wanted to make sure I captured the African-American experience, and each and every last one of them were from the inner city context. I interviewed 10 participants. 9 were African-American women and 1 African-American male, and he represents the ecclesial perspective because he actually works from a ministry perspective with HIV patients. Broke them down into 2 categories. That's the target group, and my target group consists of African-American women with HIV and 1 who actually dated a man 9 years and had an HIV scare. And fortunately, she was not diagnosed with HIV. The non-target group can just consist of healthcare, community, and the ministry portions of my interview. A confidentiality agreement form was given and signed so that they knew exactly what my research was and what approach I was using and how beneficial it would be to the inner city of Chicago and to African-American women with HIV. This leads me to my next slide. My limitations. It was hard trying to schedule interviews. I wish that I could go further and talk to more people in the healthcare field, but I tried calling and scheduling interviews, emailing, but there was no reply, no phone calls. Of course, I got through to some of them, but of course the doctors were busy, could not talk. Their schedules were back and forth, so some of them were out of town, out of the country, things of that sort. Even I found out that inner city clinics, and these are HIV clinics, STI clinics, they were being closed down. And I wish I can go further into that and talk about my experience with that in my Q&A. But even the voicemails were full, so I could not get through to most of the HIV clinics. This leads me to my next slide. some of the codes that I found. There were over 25 codes, but I wanted to highlight these. And Dr. Jill, I wanted to connect these codes with my problem statement. As you can see, the problem statement consists of low income and unemployment and poor housing and decline in Chicago public schools. These are some of the themes that were extracted from my interviews. And they were such as abuse, poverty, crime, community, lack of education, lack of health care, grew up without parents, Inglewood, that's for the inner city, South Side, fear, stigma, North Side versus South Side. I wish I can go into, if I had time, to go into the dichotomy between the North Side and the South Side, even molestation. So these are very much so, and that abuse is connected to drugs, so substance abuse. So these things are connected to the problem statement, suggesting that what has become a problem is really an issue, and we found that out in our interviews. Next, the outcomes. These are just an analysis for what the coders actually analyzed from just the results. And I'll read through them very quickly. Lack of education. This is what the inner city suffers with. Substance abuse, drug addiction, broken homes. Some of them, have experienced rape and molestation. The ghetto is a broken place that contributes to the way that African Americans think in the inner city. Spirituality is important because it helps one cope with HIV. HIV is a death sentence. HIV is stigmatized against African American people. They suffer from employment. The Black church should be less judgmental, less fearful of African American women with HIV, and should become advocates. They have experience being raised without parents and rejection from their families due to having HIV, and the Black diet is still poor within the inner city. I'm almost done, but this is my next slide. Because these things are an issue in the inner city, as a result, Shalom communities would benefit African American women in the inner city of Chicago by bringing the following. Reconciliation, and these are in connectivity to the slides that I just showed you and some of the analysis that we found in the research. Safety, counseling, healthy community, developing healthier mindsets, spiritual coping, provide escape from the stigma, economic support, provide togetherness and community, healthier dieting and exercise, provide housing for those that do not have housing, provide resources for insurance and medicine, and academic fortitude. Next slide. To bridge the gap, and I'll go through this very quickly because I'm running out of time, but I'll just talk about, all of this adds to my problem statement, the theological framework for the African-American milieu, the church, and the healthcare system. God gives us a role in the midst of this. And in the midst of this, our role is simply this: because there is poverty, because there is unemployment and poor housing and high rates in crime, and because there is not just poor in economic deficiency or economic instability, but there's poor in spirit. And so God gives us a role. Be generous to the poor, provide economic support, give land, and defend them. The next thing God does, even though there's the church has a stigma not a stigma, but a skepticism toward persons with HIV, James chapter 5 and 14 and 15 gives us a rubric, a framework, a strategy for how we should care for those with HIV. Perhaps they did not contract HIV from sleeping around or immorality, but the Bible says forgive those who have sinned. The next thing, if they had not contracted it from multiple sex partners and drugs, say for instance they were married and their spouse actually contracted HIV and they received it from their spouse, gather them, love them, assist them, and pray for them. Pray for them. Our goal also, as far as the healthcare system, our role, is to help wash the stigmas and the pressures of HIV from these African American women. Next slide. Here is my intervention strategy. Here's what I want to build in the inner city of Chicago. Here's how I want to transform the inner city of Chicago through these 6 subjects. And that's pastoral care and counseling. This deals with the psychological and emotional, mental framework. Because of the counseling aspect, many of them have experienced trauma from being diagnosed with HIV. Also, learning how to forgive those who actually gave them HIV, learning how to actually get over being rejected and living without parents, and being born and raised in the African American community, and going through the Black experience and being poor. Counseling and pastoral care will unpack them. It will open them up to something new. Spiritual healing, the spiritual coping aspect. 100% plant-based dieting, learning what wheatgrass shots are and why ginger is important, why alkaline water is important, why colonics are important, why foot detox are important to their lymphatic systems, and how it boosts their immune system, to exercise, how much important that is for their bodies, along with taking medicine. Workforce development, giving them the chance, using that reflective leadership component through Baki, how they can actually take on the ability to become hope through developing the skill set through the Shalom community, learning what it is to be a CEO, learning what it is to build their own business strategies and things of that sort. Also housing, those of them that are on the street. We know that all African American women are not poor. And I know Dr. Payne, Dr. Jill, Dr. Tai, I'm running over time. I have 2 more slides to go, but I just wanted to just clarify why the intervention strategy is important. Housing, there are many African American women who are on the streets and who are in crack houses who need housing. They have HIV, do not have the proper, and I have a passion for this, but they do not have the means to gather resources for medicine. They need housing, and I want to provide that through the Shalom community. Academic programs, these conversations have already started in how we can develop this in the inner city of Chicago, giving them the skill set. For those of them that do not have their GEDs, those of them that need their bachelor's and associates, and to move on. Maybe a master's might come out of this. Maybe a doctorate might come out of this. That's where that calling-based approach from Baki, the leadership approach comes, where they can actually learn their call, become something better, learn their vocation wherewith they have been called. The last thing, community gardening, to understand that they are not alone. And this is how redemption, restoration, and hope comes about, through conversation, through their testimony. I wish I can go further into what some of the authors and the people in my research have actually have talked about in regards to the authority that they would gain through telling their stories through community gardening. Also to build crops that might be used for their 100% plant-based diet and exercise. Last slide. This is how I've seen myself as a transformational agent. Jeremiah 21 and 22, and I'll blaze through this. Is there no balm in Gilead, or is there no medicine in Gilead? Is there no physician? Why is there no healing for the wounds of my people? I actually took these pictures. The picture at the top that says 69th Street, that medical center is 2 blocks away from my home here in Chicago, Illinois. And this is in the inner city of Chicago, in Inglewood. And this has been shut down for people who actually could afford to go to this clinic. I saw myself as a balm. I saw myself as a healer. I became a personal intercessor for this project, developing more of a passion and a love for African-American women with HIV. And I'll talk about that even more as to why I began this journey and why African-American women with HIV are so important to me. Isaiah 58 and 12. Some of you will rebuild desert ruins of the cities, and you will be known as a rebuilder of walls and a restorer of homes. I saw myself as a repairer of the breach and a restorer of the homes and the streets to dwell in. I saw myself transforming the inner city of Chicago. In 20 years, I saw the Shalom communities in newspapers around the country just for their help to African-American women with HIV in Chicago's inner city. Last slide. What did I learn? There is, in fact, a church in the inner city of Chicago by the name of Trinity United Church of Christ, who actually it's the home of President Barack Obama. They actually, the pastor there, Dr. Otis Moss, is my Morehouse brother and a very good friend. And he has a HIV ministry. It's a mega church here in the inner city of Chicago. And what I found out was that 85% of that ministry consists of the HIV ministry consists of homosexual African-American men who need spiritual guidance more than financial assistance. These are well-to-do men, people who own their own companies, lawyers, doctors, things of that sort. But they just want to know how to actually cope with or live through this diagnosis. Even the leader of that ministry has HIV and has lived with it for years. I'll take a break here, Dr. Payne, Dr. Jill, Dr. Tayi, but I would love to go deeper later in our conversation as to what I found in the inner city of Chicago doing my research as God in the midst, or God, or the work that God is doing in the midst of the inner city of Chicago. Thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you, Kenneth. I so appreciate your passion that the Lord has given you.
Yes, sir.
In this desperate need that you are looking at, and asking the Lord just for direction and wisdom and resources to bring this Shalom House about.
Yes, sir.
Well, let's do a little bit of thinking, discussing. What would you like Kenneth to elaborate on? Like you say, he's gotten through some of his stuff more quickly, but I know he has a lot more to say.
Yes, sir. I actually have a few more I would like to elaborate on, and this is this idea of this transformative theology. And I talked about how the Shalom community would be this place within the inner city of Chicago where there would be this ideal, this notion of redemption, restoration, and hope. And I would like to elaborate on what that looks like from the intervention strategies and those 6 components that I would use to establish in my business plan in the inner city of Chicago. But redemption, I use this idea of, Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 6, where it says that, and God says, I passed by thee and saw thee polluted in thy blood, and I told thee to live. And that's on page 41 of my dissertation. But basically what that's saying in context to my research in African-American women with HIV is that even with the stigma of HIV, that these Shalom communities will provide life to them. It's almost like God is God at work in the community and saying, I know that you have been stigmatized by HIV, but I have passed by thee and I've told thee to live. And this is how you're going to live. You're going to live by eating the proper foods. You're going to live by doing community gardening and telling other people your story, for you overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of your testimony. There's one author in my research, and this is in the incarnational leadership approach in the beginning, in the introduction of my dissertation, where Dr. Leighton Ford simply says that the earmark of hope is the possession of one's story, when they can take their story and own and have authority over it, even in the midst of trial. And I think that this is redemption also for African-American women, that even if God is present in the midst of her, it is possible that redemption can occur. Also, this idea of 1 Peter chapter 5 and 10, after you have suffered a while, I will restore you and make you strong and affirm you, and then make you steadfast. So redemption does occur. C.S. Lewis also in my dissertation, somewhere in my dissertation, I simply quote him. He talks about the problem of pain. That problem, that pain hurts, but it's not a problem. That it's through your pain that your ministry arises. So I believe that these African-American women who have been diagnosed with HIV, it is through the trauma, through the stigmas, through the diagnosis that they arise. They know that the HIV is not a death sentence, but they can actually make it through and understand that other people are just like them, and that through a proper dieting and through exercising and through housing and through counseling, that they can actually become whole and better and advocates for their community. This idea of restoration, through the intervention strategies, I use this idea, and I quote Joel chapter 2 and 25. I'll restore the years that you have lost to the cankerworm and the palmerworm and things of that sort, to the years that you've lost being diagnosed, where you feel like your years have been taken away from you, that because you are diagnosed with HIV, there's nothing else left for you. My idea is to be that balm, to let them know, to be that transformative agent, that prophetic voice in their life, to let them know that there is life after this. Shelley Rambo, on page 45 of my dissertation, she talks about this theology of remaining, right? And she simply says that she uses Jesus as an example. He talks to the disciples, and he simply says that I know it's painful that I've left here, and I'm paraphrasing, that I've left here. I know that I'm leaving, and I know that what just happened to me on the cross was grotesque and it was very gruesome to the culture. But you have an objective. You have to live through it, and you have to continue. Right? It's this theology of remaining, surviving through the trial. These African American women can be restored. And lastly, this idea of hope through the intervention strategies. On page 44, we go into what this resurrection looks like. That even though this is a very tough situation with HIV amongst African American women, that death is behind and life is ahead. That's quoted by Shelley Rambo again on page 44. That there is hope after this, and I can go further into that as well. But that's some things that I just wanted to elaborate on, just so that we were clear and that I didn't leave that piece out as a transformative theological component to the intervention strategies that I would like to implement in the Shalom community.
Forgot to turn on my microphone. There I am, back on. Thank you, Kenneth. Yeah, that redemptive theology is just a good piece to elaborate on for us a little bit.
Yes, sir.
Let's allow some others to ask questions now, and just other points of clarification or thoughts you'd like to bring forth. And anybody can just go ahead and jump in now.
Yes, sir.
Hi,
Kenneth. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
This is Dr. Champion. Just thank you for such an amazing, powerful this defense. It really was very good. I have one question for you. Can you elaborate on how your targeted population, how they were identified and selected?
Yes, absolutely. So it was actually difficult, Dr. Champion, to select even those who were diagnosed with HIV because of the stigma and the fear associated with it in the African American community. There are people who either don't like to go get tested, but there are people who actually have HIV who are afraid to tell their story. So just to make it clear, I was doing some research on the internet because I wanted to know what are some ministries who actually work directly with HIV patients, and I found the Emmaus Ministry. That's the African American man that I interviewed for my dissertation, and I went up. It's actually located up north, and I sat with him and had an amazing interview session. And he simply says to me, he says, "Hey, I know somebody else that you would actually love to draw information from. She's been working with HIV patients also for 20 plus years, and her name is Kim. And Kim is also how I met Dr. Tayi. And Kim, after I interviewed Kim as well, and Kim says, hey, I know a few people who you would actually draw from. There's a conference that's getting ready to take place here in Chicago, and I could gather these women together, and you can actually sit with them and learn their story. And there is where I met Dr. Tayi and a few others, just gathering their story. I remember we were sitting at a small table, and I just collected data from the conversation that we were having. And there's actually one African-American lady, and I would like to call her a young lady. She actually goes to my church, and she's been diagnosed. I've been knowing her for years, and she doesn't mind because she actually has a story that's been told, and actually 2 books that are out. Her name is Annette. And Annette, I reached out to Annette, and I said, Annette, I would love to just capture your story. She said, Ken, you could definitely capture my story. So it wasn't easy to gather research from African-American women who actually live with HIV, but I got a connection through the Emmaus Ministry, through Kim, and then from Kim at the conference, and I just gathered all of that information from at least 3 African-American women at one time, just hearing their story.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Kenneth, I have a few questions.
Okay.
Dr. Champion actually addressed one of my other questions, so thank you for that, Dr. Champion. So let's see, which order do I want to go in? Yeah. What was the value add of including the participant who dated a man with HIV?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Dr. Gio. I talk about in my introduction how premarital sex, how this connection between African-American men, also the increase in incarceration. And I didn't call it the down low, but I talked about how there's some men who are in extramarital affairs, who actually are married. They sleep with their wives, but they also have a relationship with other men, and how they actually come home and bring those diseases home to the HIV virus home to their wives. And that was a big component also. And I would like to talk about even the increase. And I'll do that. And I'll finish my point first, and then I'll go to the increase, Dr. Jill. But how this one participant had dated this man for 9 years, and literally at the end of their dating, literally the last year, he just came to her and was like, I have HIV. And she tells her story how it was a very traumatic time in her life, how she cried, and her mother was folding towels one day, and how she came in the house, she said, "Mama, he has HIV," and how her mother looked at her and said, "Yeah, but you are okay." And how she said, "Go get tested." And she went and got tested 3 times, and she didn't have HIV. But it's the scare. I wanted to include her story in this component because I know that this is a problem when associated with African American women with HIV. She goes in to talk about even her best friend and I put this in my dissertation. Her name is Nene, who actually died of AIDS. Nene gave birth to a baby who was actually he was born when she had the virus. He was born with HIV, and his name is London. London actually died 5 years ago. And so just talking about this, it just meant a lot to have her in the midst of this, because I know that those premarital affairs and incarceration and the down low perspective of men sleeping with men and still being married to women still exists in the African American community. And I want to deal with specifically with the African American community. And I know it exists around the country, but specifically within my research, the African American community. I would also like Dr. Jill to talk about how that increase happened, that jump between 2014 and 2018 began. And I would like to point out this idea of drugs. I did say incarceration. There's a point in my dissertation where I say that how drugs is a cause of the increase, of HIV increase in the African American community, incarceration and the lack of contraception, and also men sleeping with men.
Okay, and so I want to follow up on this same line of questioning.
Yeah.
And ask you how the case that you mentioned, this woman who dated a man with HIV, and women like her, how your Shalom community directly impacts or benefits women like this.
Absolutely. Thank you for that that question, Dr. Jill. I use that case study to also extract the counseling components to that, what she was going through psychologically, and what she was going through mentally. I think also in my case study, I literally quoted that the condition of life for African American women with HIV is their mental clarity. And I understand that we look on the outward appearance, but we don't necessarily know what actually goes on mentally, emotionally, innately, or inwardly with these women, the trauma, the things that they deal with on an everyday basis, not being able to get married or not being able to have children due to their diagnosis. I wanted to make sure that I honed in very deeply on what this looks like in the African American community. Dr. Jill, if you could restate that, I just got sidetracked just for a few minutes. Could you just restate that question one more time?
Mm-hmm, sure, yeah. So for women like the woman you included who dated a man with HIV,
yes.
How does your Shalom community impact that demographic, given that she does not have HIV?
Perfect. In that case study, or you mean the woman who was not affected by HIV?
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. I talk about this idea of reflective leadership, using Baki's approach. Baki's approach it talks about how the leader becomes the embodiment of hope, and how their stories are used as catalysts for symbols of courage and things of that sort. And then also how this prophetic leadership approach, and how they become advocates. Once they find out their calling, they become advocates, using her story and the traumatic traumatic experience she went through, or just the scare and having the best friend who died of HIV, perhaps she doesn't have to go through the counseling, or perhaps she doesn't have to go through housing, or she doesn't have to go through the other components. But her story is a major component, and I think that that will be something that will help those who are not diagnosed with HIV, those who are diagnosed with HIV. It would give them some sense of courage. Hey, you've been through what I've been through. And even though I contracted HIV, hey, this is how you can make it through. And I know that I may not have it and you may have it, but let's get through this together. Why? Because we do have one thing in common. We have the Black experience. And this is how we can transform the inner city together, right? I have something that you need and you have something that I need. That's what that community garden is for, to create conversation, to create some sense of belonging. Hey, we've been through this together, and also establishing the idea of growing crop together, right? It's the sense of planting seeds and watering those seeds and watching them come to life, and then doing it together.
Thank you. And one more question, and I promise I will not ask anything else.
It's okay. Absolutely.
So on your slide, on your What Did I Learn slide, you mentioned that's it. You connected with someone who leads a ministry for men who have contracted HIV, and I wanted to know how that learning or that new insight connects to, or how you've thought about how you could synthesize that with your research focus on women with HIV.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dr. Jill. I actually, and forgive me for this, I did not add that ministry is not for not for African-American men or homosexual men. I simply said that it was just 85% of that ministry that consists of homosexual African-American men. And I should have talked about the other 25%, but there are women who are part of that ministry. And forgive me, Dr. Payne, Dr. Jill, Dr. Tai, for not including that information. But there are a lot of homosexual marriages and a lot of spouses that do have HIV, and the other spouse may not have it. So there are women who are a part of this ministry. And I believe that it would be something that I could add to my research, very beneficial, because African-American women are a part of this ministry. And one component that adds to this is the spiritual coping, right? I talk about how they are well-to-do people, how they have jobs, and they are business owners, and they're lawyers and doctors and things of that sort. This church is very well-to-do, but there's one thing that they actually have in common with what I will establish at my Shalom community, and that's the spiritual coping, pastoral care, and counseling component.
Let me just piggyback on that question a little bit here, Kenneth.
Okay.
So through that ministry at Trinity United Church, I think that's where this ministry is at. You kind of got some contacts, I think, through. Well, no, I guess that was with the Emmaus. You kind of made some contacts with your sample.
Yes.
Try to think, because of this project, what have you learned that you didn't know before you really did this project? I mean, you've been passionate about this issue, but did you just try to think about going through this project, what has actually just become very important to you? You've learned, it's just made a big difference. So just kind of keep on that topic for a moment, what you've really learned through this process.
Yes, sir. If I can go deeper into that, one thing I actually deleted from the slide because I actually give reference to it in some of my dissertation, but I did learn very, very deeply, Dr. Payne, that again, all African-American women with HIV are not poor. And I know that the premise of my dissertation was dealing with poverty and African-American women who could not afford, medical insurance and things of that sort, and healthier foods. But I learned that some of these women, especially the women, and the reason why I did not interview the 25% at Trinity is because some of these women are women that make over 6 figures. So they don't necessarily, they can afford, right, certain things, certain foods and things of that sort. Many of them live in beautiful homes and drive the most beautiful cars. So I didn't want to interview them, but I did learn that there are some working class, there's some women that make $45,000, that make $30,000, that work at clinics and social work and things of that sort. And many of them are married. Some of them have families. Some of them have aspirations and things of that sort. So again, not concluding that all African-American women with HIV are poor or don't have any vocation or any verbiage of their vocation or what God has called them to do. But the basis or the majority of what I wanted to deal with was those that do not necessarily have those aspirations and those who are homeless and do not have the.
Right, yeah. So as you pull together a Shalom community, you possibly will have a mixture of women who are in very poor circumstances, but you may also have some women who actually come from fairly well-to-do kinds of situations.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. If I could, Dr. Payne, if I could, and I know there are more questions, but I would like to talk about this, what I found in the community, that there are no healthier restaurants and things of that sort, but on 87th and Ashland, and this is just a limited a number of what I found in the community. This is one of just a few. This is a place that I go to, Divine Healing Herbs. They actually do foot detox and things of that sort. This is in the inner city of Chicago and Inglewood. They do colonics. You would like to educate the African American community, on eating better and things of that sort. But this business is actually threatening to close because they do not have a lot of visitors. And Dr. Miss Owens is her name. She's the owner. Miss Owens, she's never worked with HIV patients, and if she has, nobody's really said anything about them having HIV because of the fear or the stigma associated. The Soul Vegetarian Restaurant, they've been in business in the inner city of Chicago for 38 years, very successful, but they have a lot of the working class, a lot of people who actually can afford their prices and things of that sort. Very good restaurant. They work to establish, healthy foods in the community and things of that sort. Black-owned business, but this is one of just a few. And lastly, I actually found out about this restaurant 3 days ago on 79th and Exchange in South Shore, and this is one of the communities that I've done my research. On this day, 3 days ago, it was a very, very good day. I actually got a chance to meet with the chefs who have been cooking for 30 years. That's Chef Nasa and Chef Sadikia, and actually they're from that's Swahili. They've been cooking over 30 years as a Black-owned business. They've been there for about 10 months now, so the community doesn't know about them, and they're still growing, but a lot of their community doesn't really know what vegan restaurants are or the importance of vegan. Now, there's some that do, but they have not encountered people with HIV just yet. But I would love to work with them in the future in just establishing the Shalom community.
Okay.
Kenneth, Mr. Nole, I have one more question.
Okay.
And kind of going back and thinking about your sample and the target population, what tool or approach did you utilize to shamar and or protect their confidentiality?
Absolutely. So what I did was I gave them confidentiality agreement forms where they signed it. In the confidentiality agreement form, we just talked about what my dissertation was about, how beneficial it would be to the inner city of Chicago, and that I would not share their information outside of the context of my dissertation, and that it would be published, and that they would be okay with that. Another thing, this is the reason why I manually recorded my interviews, and I manually recorded the interviews because I wanted it to be authentic. Because of the fear and the stigma associated with HIV, I wanted it to be as comfortable as possible. And because I wanted to connect with these women, I wanted their stories, I wanted my time with them to be very authentic. And so I took very time and just just writing down their responses, making sure I went back to ask questions over again to make sure that I got their response well and things of that sort. And so that was my approach in making sure that I protected their confidentiality. Even Catherine, even though her story is one that aided and pushed my research in this field, her name is not Catherine, and I promised her that I would not tell her name. Her name is Catherine in my defense, and I made sure I gave them another name if I had to.
Okay, and
Yep.
that was my that was my question. Were pseudonyms
Yes,
utilized throughout your data, and was it noted as such? That
absolutely.
there would be pseudonyms. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. You're absolutely welcome. Thank you, Dr. Champion.
This is Dr. Tai. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Tai.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Just a couple questions. First,
Yeah.
thanks for making the correlation between the prevalence of Black men, MSM, Black men, and Black women with HIV, because there's definitely a correlation there between the prevalence in both groups.
Yes.
So even though I'm in Nashville in the South,
Yeah.
we still kind of tackle with the same issue.
Yeah.
Regarding HIV among African American women. Just some practical questions. I work with this population every day. So some of the problems that I see with any kind of diet, but specifically now, because a lot of my clients are going into plant-based diets, the issue that's coming up is the conflict with other medications that they're taking, conflict with too much.
Yeah.
So too much of the vitamins on their liver and kidneys, because even though these drugs are wonderful, there's still an issue with too much stress on the liver and kidneys, which the drugs already have.
Yes.
So have you looked into that at all?
I have, Dr. Tai. Thank you so much for that question. Just doing more research on the plant-based diet. I know that there's certain foods, there's some herbs that you can actually take that you should minimize on. So this is something I want to actually include in my 100% plant-based structure and strategy within the Shalom community of just how much to take, right? How much to eat. What are some proper juices to actually drink and things of that sort. And then also, at what point do we not cut off the medicine? At what point, and this might sound crazy, and I might get in trouble for this, Dr. Tai, but at what point do we refrain from taking certain medicines because the 100% plant-based dieting has done such a marvelous job in the immune systems, or because again, if the medicine or the foods are in combat with each other, something's got to stop, or something has to be, or maybe not diminish, or maybe just pull back just a little bit. And so if there's an increase in the 100% plant-based diet, perhaps there's one point, maybe 6 months in, we can refrain from taking one side of or piece of prescription, maybe doctor approved, maybe have some to go in with some MDs who might approve this and to let us know what are the benefits behind this. Is it healthy? Can we do this within 6 months? And so I have actually looked into some research with that, just to understand the African American, or excuse me, the 100% plant-based diet brings oxygen to the body, and there is no disease that can live within an oxygenated body. So if oxygen lives within a body, perhaps there is no need to continually take certain medicines, even though, again, they might have to take medicine.
Yeah, I would. I know we have pharmacies here in Nashville that works with exactly that, working with herbs and the heart medication. Yeah. Because the danger would be, just from a clinical standpoint, of them coming off the medicine. However, there are 8 different, for instance, 1-a-day regimens now. So there's so many different regimens. I think it's more towards the point of changing their regimen.
Absolutely.
And finding one that would fit with the plant-based diet. So
yeah, absolutely, Dr. Tai, and I believe that 100% plant-based dieting will decrease their viral loads.
Right.
And you're right. So if it decreased their viral loads, then again, they can change their regimen for taking the medicines.
Exactly. My other question is regarding Ryan White.
Yes.
And it was very well stated. And I know currently, I think in Illinois is 500% below the or above the poverty level that they can still receive Ryan White. I think it was changed a little bit, but that's good.
Yeah, 300%.
Okay, it's 300%. Okay.
Yeah, 300%. Yes.
Okay, because in some places it's 500. I know that's state by state.
Yeah.
So, also just for information point, some of the companies will also pay not pay the premium, but pay for the cost of the medication, which is about $3,000 a month just for the HIV medication.
Yeah.
And the point that Ryan White only takes care of HIV medication, so if they have diabetes or anything else, it won't take care of that. So that was a good point.
Thank you.
Okay, that was it. That was it for me.
Thank you, Dr. Tai. Dr. Payne,
Yes.
Dr. Jill, I would like to also add this. If I could have done something differently in my research, I would have. One thing that, and this is also a passion for mine, and this is for further research, but I would have gathered information from other cities, and you'll find here on this slide, Los Angeles and Seattle and Houston, Atlanta, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, just what their inner cities are going through, and what African-American women in those inner cities, what they have need of as it pertains to HIV and the need for shalom communities there.
Well, Kenneth, I'll just say that I think it was smart to focus on Chicago, just so you're narrowing the number of variables that you have to work with and examine, but you certainly have an agenda for future research, and I would encourage you to expand your sample nationally. And along with that, I want to ask you, given the limitations and the challenges that you had in gathering participants or recruiting participants, what might you do differently? What methods might you use to recruit participants for a national sample?
You know, honestly, Dr. Jill, I haven't really thought into it because, and I think I'm really stuck at this this idea that there's still stigma and fear associated with HIV. And so I need time to strategize and to, in developing my Shalom community in the business plan, perhaps connect with someone who has marketing experience, or how we can actually connect with other African-American women, or these 3,422, or the increasing number of African-American women with HIV. If I can connect probably with the ministry, the HIV ministry at Trinity, perhaps they have other resources, and just start with what's around me and what I've already used. Perhaps the women such as Annette at my church who may know other African-American women who have HIV, and just broaden my reach from that spectrum.
This is Bill Payne again. Let me just ask kind of another concluding type question.
Yes, sir.
At BGU, as you know, we really focus on the whole concept of being a transformational leader. Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Some components of a transformational leader are, at least in my mind, is a person who is able to facilitate processes, facilitate relationships. We also emphasize a lot on collaboration. And so a person who is a transformational leader is going to be gaining skills at collaboration with other people, other organizations, other ministries, whatever it happens to be. With those kinds of thoughts in mind, let me ask you a couple things. Number one, what have you learned about being a transformational leader? And number two, what are the next specific steps you're going to need to take if you're going to keep at this project so that the Shalom community becomes a reality? But maybe just start out by, what have you learned about being a transformational leader through this process?
Thank you so very much for that question, Dr. field, I've learned as a transformational leader that transformational leaders are revolutionary. And so what they do is they go into a context not just to find the problem, but to present the solution. That sometimes they have to do work in the midst of a culture, a people, a system that does not want to change. And it's not difficult being a transformational leader. Why? Because you have to bring transformation to something that has been solid. And in the inner city of Chicago, where there has been poverty and where there has been kind of like a wall or barrier, it has been hard for a lot of people to break that system, to break that wall of poverty and oppression, especially in the inner city context. So what I've learned is you simply have to put on the whole armor of God and be the revolutionary. It doesn't matter if it takes years. But transformational leaders are those who are in the trenches. They're people who are served in the trenches for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years until it actually manifests. And so transformational leaders are those people who lay down their lives, for the cause of something, not just to build a legacy, not just to gain influence, but to be the restorers of those. Why? Because there are generations who are after me. And so I literally, I'm ready to give myself to the work, however that looks, however that begins. Dr. Payne, could you please state the next question, the question number 2?
The next question is simply, what are the next specific steps you're going to need to take in order to keep moving forward on this plan to establish a Shalom community?
Yes, sir. Dr. Payne, I think that there should be a way that you approach the community first before you actually establish a Shalom community. I thought through this before, is that, and I'll add this to my business plan. I did not add it to my dissertation. And the reason why is because I don't necessarily want to add it, because I want it to be something that just emerges from the inner city of Chicago as a forerunner of my Shalom community. And that is to develop something where the inner city of Chicago can be attracted to this place. And what I'm thinking is to open a 100% plant-based spa and juicery. Whereas the entire community, right, they see this place, oh my God, I can go here and get fresh smoothies, and I can go here and get a wheatgrass facial, or a charcoal facial, or sit in a sauna that's drenched in charcoal or whatever have you, or different herbs and spices and things of that sort. That's 100% beneficial for the body. I mean, this will be a target to the entire city of Chicago. I can use this by its means to actually move into this idea of the Shalom community, that this is beneficial for African American women with HIV, and also with prices and things of that sort, for just to market to people who have cancer and diabetes and other STIs and things of that sort. Even want to implement within the juicery how there are certain benefits. So when you walk into this, I'm giving you my entire vision, but you can see how passionate I am about just the framework, how I build this. But a lot of people in the inner city of Chicago are not abreast or not educated on the benefits of fruit and vegetables. So when you walk into this juicery, or when you have a wheatgrass facial or whatever, or sage facial, you'll know the benefits of what it does in and for your body. And so I think that this is a segue for me to get connected to other people who are from government, people who are from the church, people who are from the universities, people from other places, and that being the face or the framework or the prerequisite to moving into the Shalom community.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, any other thoughts, questions before we move into an evaluation session? Okay, I think with that, then we are going to move into that's part of the session. So what I'll need to do, I'm going to put a few of you on hold. Your screen, I think, will say you're on hold. Please just bear with us for about 15 minutes, and then I will bring you back into the session. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, I think I've got Dr. Gilliam, got Dr. Link, and myself. And Dr. Gilliam, you are, of course, the supervisor. Dr. Link, you functioned as a second reader, and then I'm kind of functioning as the BGU rep. Let me share my screen here for a moment.
Thank you.
Have a few, yes. You might have a few things to revise before submitting for final publication.
Okay.
But they're minor.
Okay.
But yeah. Hello, Dr. Kenneth.
Yes, yes, yes. So, I mean, long and patient, but yeah, I haven't had sleep within the last week or so, and just kind of getting ready for this moment. But I want to Dr. Payne in this journey with you since last January 2017, and just going back and forth with edits and just hearing your expertise and your wisdom. Just you being patient in the process, and Jamal, of course, has been a part of my PLC, but my life, and got together, and it brings me joy to share this moment, and just for encouragement, she's been such a great support system. Helped me through the room while and so it brings me joy that champion your leadership. I watched it head on, and just for who you are in Chicago, and for just your level of expertise that you exude. And Dr. Tayi, of course, we've known each other for a very short time, but you your part of me with me. Dr. Joe, I thank you for last because, of course, you taught so much. You stretched me beyond, and I knew this day would come, and we're finally here. But the days when I have to edit more, and of course, needing your expertise and your knowledge on certain things, you are always present. I don't know. All I can say is thank you. Just for giving your time. I knew that you were the one to walk me through this journey, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, man, I don't know what to say. I'm so nervous.
Wow.
Yeah. We're here.
Okay, thank you. I'm having some connection issues here, but if you guys can still hear me, I want to just say congratulations also, Kenneth, and just been good to be working with you, and just praying that the Lord is going to give you great wisdom to bring about that Shalom House in Chicago.
Yes, sir.
So with that, I think Dr. Gilliam will work with you just a little bit, just a couple things. We just wanted you to kind of work on a couple more things in the actual written report. But other than that, you did a great job, and we just want to thank you and continue to trust the Lord will just do some amazing things through this project. All right.
Amen.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to need to close the session down. And again, just thanks for all of you for being with us, and God just be with us all.
Amen. God bless you all.
Thank
God bless you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Amen. All right.